Today in the shop, we'll be walking through a misfire diagnosis on a Toyota 4Runner. First, you want to check for codes. Here we have a misfire code. You want to review the layout of the engine to know which cylinder you're after.
So number 5 is the back one. We're going to pull the plug, take a look at it, see if there's any obvious signs of fouling or any other obvious issues.
So we're going to go ahead and remove that ignition coil on cylinder 5 after the air cleaner's off. Remove the electrical connectors, the 10 millimeter bolt, and pull that coil out.
If there's any signs of arcing, burn through, everything looks good. The spring's still intact down in the bottom. Looks okay.
Next, remove the spark plug, also from that same cylinder.
Number 5 plug. Looks newer. Don't see any signs of fouling. It looks in good shape. There's no carbon tracking or arcing down the porcelain. So we'll get a compression test.
Next step will be a compression test. We'll go ahead and disconnect the ignition coils on the remaining cylinders to prevent the engine from starting. And then set up the compression gauge. Now you'll want to remove an adjacent spark plug as well to compare that whole side of the engine. Go ahead and crank the engine over.
So if we go for a test drive and it starts misfiring, and the misfire moves from cylinder 5 to cylinder 3, we know it's ignition. Seal out moisture, and it also aids in pulling it off in the future.
So once the spark plugs are swapped and the ignition coil is swapped, go ahead and reconnect the electrical connectors and then reinstall the air intake. Vacuum hoses and tighten those clamps on the air boot.
Any codes, Eric?
Nothing.
No misfire, no codes. It's going to be a little tricky.
So after swapping the ignition components, the misfire did not move. It stayed on cylinder 5. So we're going to disassemble and do some more testing. Go ahead and remove that air intake boot. Take off the electrical connectors and vacuum hose from the throttle body. Remove the throttle body linkage. And then remove the throttle body bolts.
So we're going to disconnect these coolant hoses on the bottom of the throttle body, which are used to preheat the throttle body and give better atomization of the fuel.
So once those hoses are disconnected, now we can remove the throttle body itself.
So the first thing we're going to do is pull these connectors. We're going to check the resistance for the primary windings on these two connectors and see where we're at as far as spec. That is a problem. We got an injector going bad.
Next, we're going to remove the banjo fittings from the fuel rail. Those fittings are on the front and the back of the fuel rail. And you're also going to just loosen that fitting on the opposite rail. You're going to want to clean that area out really well.
So now we're pulling the bolts off that hold the fuel rail to the intake. So we're going to pull all three injectors on bank number 1 as a set.
And these injectors have been in there for a while, so they're probably a little sticky. So we got our new injector. We've got new O-rings for the old injectors.
We're going to clean that area out really well. Don't want any contamination getting into those fuel rails. Now we can start reassembling. Going to lubricate the O-rings on the top and the bottom of the fuel injectors. And then we can go ahead and start putting that rail back in. Carefully push down on that to fully seat the fuel injectors in the intake manifold. We'll start those bolts, but don't tighten them all the way. And then we'll also start the banjo bolts, but not fully tighten them at this point. I'll put some new crush washers in there. There'll be 2 washers, one on either end of the rail. Just make sure you start those by hand so there's no damage to the aluminum threads. Can be a little bit tricky. Got to hold that rail in place and then keep those washers from dropping out as well. Now that everything is hand tightened, we can go back and torque them. The 2 fuel rail bolts will be to 15 foot-pounds. And then you can tighten the banjo bolts, and those would be to 25 foot-pounds. Now we'll reconnect the electrical connectors for those fuel injectors. Clean off the old gasket for the throttle body.
Okay, so we got the 2 coolant lines, and then we've got 1 air line. So I think we'll put this air line on first.
So we can go ahead and torque those throttle body bolts to 15 foot-pounds. Plug the connectors back in and the vacuum lines. We need to reinstall the throttle cables. Careful to get those back in the position they were. And then we can install the air intake assembly one more time. tighten those clamps. Get the connectors in place and the air hoses. I'm going to check the antifreeze level, top that off. And we can start the engine and check the codes one more time.